Ok, ora è partito. Buongiorno, partiamo subito perché abbiamo, come sempre a Perugia, uno spazio limitato. Io voglio ringraziare le nostre ospiti. Abbiamo bisogno di delle cuffie per loro. Or are we going to speak English? Okay, sorry. Sorry, we are going to speak English. No, I thought you were going to have a translation, but we can switch to English, no problem at all. Before coming here, I wanted to buy Internazionale, which is a very well-known magazine here in Italy. I just forgot it. Anyway, if you look at Internazionale this week, the cover story is Yemen, the Forgotten War. And I'm very grateful to the festival, to Arianna and Chris, for being here with three of the journalists who don't let this war being forgotten, absolutely. So, Silvia Battaglia, Iona Craig, and Nawal Al-Maghafi. Before I start, before I let you speak, I just want to give an overview of what's going on in Yemen. So this is the third year of a war, which started in 2015 officially with the Saudi intervention, but it started before, and it's somehow it comes from the Arab Spring. There was a kind of a peace process, reconciliation process in Yemen, which ended up when the Houthis, who are part of Yemen, I mean, they are a very important part of Yemen from the north, took over the capital city of Sanaa. Iona was there, so she can tell us about it later. So the Saudis really feel the Houthis as a threat because they are Shia, even if they are different kind of Shia of what we are used to. So that's why they decided to step in and to start this war. I just want to say that according to the United Nations, this is the worst humanitarian crisis that the world is facing right now. Most of the Yemeni population is in need of food and assistance. There are 400,000 children who are starving. We are really talking about famine. There is cholera. The number of victims, it's very difficult to give a proper estimate, but it goes between 30 to 70,000, plus all the people who died because of the poor health conditions, famine, and everything else. So it's really a very, very bad situation that the media have not been covering very much, or not as much as we should have done it. I'll let them talk and say how they are covering Yemen. Before I start, I want to say something which is struck me and Laura Silvia yesterday night. Maybe it won't strike you because you're not Italian, but this is a female panel for female journalists talking about the forgotten war of these times, which is not something that you have to give for granted in Italy at all. So I'm very proud also because of this, and I'm very proud also because we are talking about four women who work together, help each other. I got back from Yemen last month. The first telephone call that I made was to Laura Silvia. Laura Silvia is the one who wanted this panel, and she's the one who wanted Nawal, absolutely, and she's the one who stood up yesterday when saw that Iona was not in the program and said, she must come. So we try, and I always use her dad. I always read her story, and I was really amazed yesterday when I was looking at your video, and I saw that we went to the same place on the front line in Marib, and we had the same ideas. I mean, this is going to be a never-ending story. So anyway, I'll start with Laura Silvia, with Nawal, because they are reporting out of Yemen, but with very personal implications. No? Laura Silvia is married to a Yemeni, and she has her family in Sanaa. Nawal works for the BBC, and it's thanks to her that the most important television in the world kept on covering Yemen the way they did it in these years. I mean, the BBC has been covering Yemen more than CNN, ABC, CBS, whatever. I mean, and that's thanks to Nawal. But her family is in Sanaa too. So Sanaa is under control still under the Houthi control, and they are not nice guys. The Saudis are not so nice guys too, but I mean, it's very difficult to report about something when your family is there. So how do you do it? I mean, I suppose it's easier to have access to information, but at the same time, you have to be very mindful, very careful about what you write. How do you do it?
You know, for me, I've been covering Yemen for a couple of years now, before this war began, and over time, I think it's become more and more difficult to report from Yemen. Particularly now, I think in the last few months, it's been exceptionally difficult, and I found it almost impossible now to go back. And it's for this very reason that you're talking about. It's, you know, I always get told back in London that it must be so easy for you to go and report from Yemen, because I'm originally Yemeni, I have a Yemeni passport, and in comparison to foreign journalists, it is particularly easy for me because I can just swoop into Yemen in my Yemeni passport, get through all the checkpoints, and I cover up with my niqab and headscarf, and I go through all the checkpoints just like any other Yemeni civilian. I mean, the risks at that point that I face are the same risks that any other Yemeni civilian faces on the ground. But that's where the easiness of the ease of this, for me, stops. Because straight after that, I have to think about the people I'm working with on the ground. So the way I work is I set up teams on the ground in Yemen, local cameramen, local fixers, local drivers to work with me in filming everything that we film, because I can't get a foreign crew into the country. And constantly when we're filming, you have to think about, you know, I'm lucky enough to be with you guys today. I get to fly out and leave the country. But once my story goes out, they're the ones that will have to pay the consequences of whatever we put out. I have my in-laws, my husband's family are all living in Yemen. And after every story, I worry about whether they're going to get a knock on the door about what we've been filming. When we've been covering the humanitarian situation, which is, you know, what I've been focused on in the beginning, it hasn't been as difficult because obviously the humanitarian situation has kind of played into the Houthis' favor on the ground, and so they've always been happy with the reporting we've done. We've covered the airstrikes, for example, which has also kind of played into their narrative, and so there hasn't been that much of a risk. In every piece, of course, we talk about the atrocities that they've committed too, but because there's, you know, overwhelming evidence of atrocities that have been committed by the Saudi coalition on the ground, we haven't had much anger of the Houthis, from the Houthis on the ground. But I want to speak about one of the last pieces that I just did most recently on the death of the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh. So there were clashes in the capital. Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president, and the Houthis were allies on the ground. And you know, suddenly the Houthis went against Ali Abdullah Saleh and they killed him in his home in the capital. And when he was killed, I was on my way to cover the clashes that were going on, and I made it into Sanaa just days after he was killed. And I was warned by the Houthis not to cover how he was killed. You know, they'd made it seem like he was running away from home, and he was killed while he was on his way to join the coalition. So, you know, we did what we could. It was one of the most difficult trips, but we did what we could to try and kind of uncover what exactly happened. And in doing so, we came across information that there are Iranian advisors on the ground in Sanaa. So we made a short news piece. And, you know, I didn't feel like it was so strong that there was a really big risk that something would happen to the team on the ground after I leave. You know, we evaluated the risk. So before the piece went out, we asked the team to stay in hotels, not to be at home, just until we see what happens after the piece goes out. And I think that was one of the pieces that really made me realize how difficult it is. You know, what decision do you make? Do you censor what you found out on the ground because of the dangers people may face on the ground because of your reporting? Even though you know a vital piece of information, do you keep it to yourself because you may put people in danger? Or, you know, what do you do? And I'm interested to hear how Laura's dealt with this as well.
Before I switch to you, there are things that I forgot to say because we had such a short time. But I just want to say that your investigation on the 2015 Saudi targeting of a funeral in Sanaa led the Saudi to change the rules that they're using for targeting. Again, I had an entire day of debriefing in the Saudi Ministry of Defense, and they kept on saying that after that story came out, they changed the rules because they don't want to hit civilians. So that's what she's doing. And something that I forgot to say is that Laura Silvia wrote a book which is called La Sposa Yemenita, and it's a cartoon book, and it's lovely because it's really explained what Yemen used to be before the war and how the people of Yemen are warm and very, very nice to foreigners.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Well, my status, I can say my status, my position in this conflict is in between the status of Nawal and the status of Iona, because I'm an Italian citizen, I'm an international journalist, but at the same time, as a person related to a Yemeni family, which means not a Yemeni guy, means a tribe. So much more, pounds more. And it's a position between. What means that I have quite the same problems to have access into Yemen because of my Italian passport, because I don't hold a Yemeni passport, so anytime I need to ask the coalition basically to let me get in. But when I'm inside of Yemen, I'm exactly as any Yemeni due to my marriage. And when I arrive in Sanaa, I stay around in the country, I'm exactly like any Yemeni woman. But of course, if something happened, maybe, I can say maybe, there's my country that maybe protects me, but more there is a tribe that needs to answer about what I'm doing. And if something happened to me or to my husband, something could happen to my family. So what to do? Because I'm kind of a local journalist and somehow I am kind of international journalist from the other side. My decision was to cover the humanitarian crisis as well as Nawal did, but mostly as a media person that is working as field researcher for NGOs or entities who are doing they are advisors for UN. So that's a way that helps me to do my job and at the same time also to contribute to witness this war. But there are certain topics that should be covered and we should do something. Since the beginning, before the war, I lived there for 3 years. I was very focused on the situation of the children. We are talking about children that they suffer from any kind of disease and malnutrition and anything. And children are absolutely very, very weak in this country. So it's a long time that different groups, armed groups, they use children for their purposes. They traffic children through the borders with Saudi Arabia and reported about it. And people that are guarding the borders, they buy drugs from them because they are trafficked, but they traffic drugs, and then they come back, but they stay in the prison in prisons for a long time, and that's happened before the war, and Saudis were involved in all this. But what about now, where children are pushed into the front line? And this is a very sensitive topic for local journalists who work in Houthi areas. So what to do? We know that families who they don't position themselves in one side, on the other side of the war. They don't support militias. They could receive threats because they didn't offer one child, one son to the cause. So we have a lot of neighbors that they know the pressure of the militia when they enter into the house. They break into the house and they ask, "Where is your son? We want your son. We want your son for the front line." So what to do with this? And my personal decision was to report in Italian from both sides, which is a language less distributed, I mean, and less known, and reporting in anonymity about situations that can create problems to my family in the areas where my family lives. The thing is that it's important also that the family accept this idea. It's not so common to have a family in a traditional environment to accept a foreign relative and a journalist. And I can say my family is really brave in doing that. And I'm really thankful to the fact that they support the idea when I go there to report. And that's my way to get out from all this, which is also an ethical concern about how to cover the wars. And of course, there's another problem, which is the sources. My sources are not my family sources. I'm a journalist, so I don't put the lines of my cousin or people are related to me because they are related to me, of course. As a journalist, we have, the concern to and the right, but also a duty to choose the right sources. So not just random people who are living in the streets or they live in Sanaa just because they live in Sanaa. I can say that it's a kind of struggle for me sometimes, but I also think that as a person who is in between and also can say to the others it's possible still believe in this, boundaries, even during the war, I should do it for the audience and also for our people in Yemen. So,
thank you very much. I go to Iona because you work in a very different way. First of all, I want to say that you were the last foreign journalist to leave Yemen in 2014. She has been living in Yemen for a long time and talking about outstanding journalism. I just want to mention her latest prize. She just won the Polk Award, which is the second most important prize after the Pulitzer, for her reporting, because she was the only journalist who was able to reach the place where the American did a strike a few months ago. And they said it was a success story, everything was great, but Iona went there and she found out that they killed children, women, and that the story was very different from what the White House was saying. So my question for you is, how do you work as a freelance? Because you are a freelance, you use crowdfunding, and then you report for several outlets. So how do you report, and why, in your opinion, this became the forgotten crisis?
Yeah, I mean, for me, we talk about Yemen being this kind of forgotten war, but I started living in Sanaa in 2010. I've actually lived in Sanaa longer than I've lived in any other city in my adult life anywhere in the world. So although if we're on the spectrum and Nawal is the Yemeni and we have Laura who is married to Yemeni, I kind of married to Yemen in a slightly different way. And really the issue over access a lot of the time comes back to the fact that the international media never really covered Yemen to the extent that they did other countries in the region. And even during the 2011 uprising, when access became difficult, it was also that many media organizations had very little interest in covering Yemen. And even now, when there is better access or people can get in, they don't have stringers on the ground. They haven't built up relationships with contacts inside the country. So even when they couldn't get access, trying to report on it remotely was incredibly difficult. Unlike somewhere like Syria, where you've got an army of journalists either in Turkey, in Istanbul, in Beirut, who have all got great contacts because they'd spent lots of time in Syria, and even when access was too dangerous, they were still able to cover the story. That's just not been the case in Yemen. And the background knowledge of the politics, even on the ground, of what was going on, and the history of the politics just went straight over the head of a lot of international journalists, even the ones that were covering the region. So for me, the issue over access, the only reason I can do what I do now really is because of that relationship I'd had with the country for the 4 years really before the conflict escalated, when the coalition got involved. I had people that I knew on both sides of what is now the front line, I guess, people in the north, people in the south, people in the east, because I traveled around the country. And when initially the bombing campaign started, and I was actually due to fly into Yemen to go back to do some reporting on March 28th and had my flight booked, and of course the bombing starts on March 26th and the airspace was shut down. And it was incredibly difficult then for foreign journalists to get in. A lot of people turned up in Djibouti trying to get on boats into the country. A lot of the time getting on those boats was incredibly expensive. You're talking, tens of thousands of dollars in some cases. And I was able to do it, and it didn't cost me a single penny because of relationships that I'd built with people living and working on the ground in Yemen over many years. And again, when I go to Yemen, I never stay in hotels. I stay with Yemeni friends. I have, like I say, Nawal was talking about having her teams. I have a little team of people that will help me in Mokalla, in Seyoun, in Sanaa, in Taiz, in Aden, and in Marib now as well, all over the country. And it means that I can work, they keep me safe, and sometimes at considerable risk to themselves, of course, but they are very willing to help me. And unfortunately, I would really like them to help other journalists as well, because access is such an issue and keeping people safe, but they don't want to do it. They don't want to take that risk. They know me and they trust me. This is, and I've said to them, listen, if you wanted to do it, there is money there that you could make, that journalists will pay you. But they just don't want to take that risk. And again, that's because of relationships that I built over many, many years. And then the other thing goes back to what you were saying at the beginning about the fact that we are a female panel. It is much easier and safer for women to get access in Yemen. And it's something I've repeatedly said, particularly to TV crews, is if you have an all-female crew, camera person, producer, and presenter, you can travel much more easily now with the issue of checkpoints everywhere. Like Nawal, I go in niqab, I go in abaya, and I travel as a Yemeni woman would do. So I travel with 2 Yemeni men, because a Yemeni woman would not be traveling on their own. And that's how I get all of my access. And it was something I started doing actually long before the war. In 2012, when there was the war in Abiyan against Al-Qaeda, and the Yemeni army was involved and the Americans were involved, and I was trying to do the usual thing of getting the Tasriya, getting permission to go into Abiyan to report on the story. And I turned up the political security office in Aden trying to get the ever-elusive piece of paper to say that I could travel. And they told me the senior military commander who was in charge of the 20,000, 30,000 troops that were fighting at that point had to sign off on it. And of course, he's the other side of Abiyan commanding his troops. And it was a Friday afternoon, and I refused to move until I got my Tasriya. And in the end, it's a Friday, it's a weekend in Yemen. They want to go home. So they knew the piece of paper wasn't going to get stamped and signed by the person who was relevant. And they said to me, listen, just put on your niqab, go in a veil, and go. And so I then realized that that was a very easy way of traveling around Yemen. When the conflict then started, and we were all trying to get into the country, I had another friend in Sanaa who was willing to drive what is a 2-day drive. You've done it across the border to Oman to come and pick me up. And he said, the only problem is, he says, your eyes are too green. So I wear contact lenses anyway, and I solved that problem by buying brown contact lenses and to make my eyes look darker. And even now, Yemeni women say to me, my goodness, I didn't realize you were a foreigner until you lifted up your veil, because after many years, you get used to playing that kind of role. It's a bit like having 2 personalities in some ways. I have my Yemeni persona and my non-Yemeni one. So you learn to walk the right way. You learn when you're in a public space how the etiquette works of just blending in with the other women that are around, particularly on the odd occasions when I went to Marib to report the story on the Navy SEAL raid in Al Baida, my Yemeni friend who was helping me on the last leg of the journey, in peacetime it would have taken, I'd done the trip before from Sanaa, it took about 4 or 5 hours. It took 4 days because I had to do like these two sides of a triangle. But we had to stay in a hotel in Marib. And as a foreigner, if you go into a hotel, you have to report to the local national security. They take your passport. And of course, I didn't want the coalition knowing that I was there to report on this story. So he had his family papers, as you do, as Laura mentioned already, to say he had his wife with him. And I became his wife for 2 days. And so we stayed in the hotel kind of under his family papers, and that was how it worked. And I've done that several times before as well. I'm not saying that people dropping in now need to go to those lengths, but it does mean if now, for example, really the only way to get into the country is flying into Aden. You can fly into Sayoun, but then to get up to Sanaa, and I have to say the Houthis make the access as difficult now as the coalition has done in the past to actually get into the country, to get up to the north. But if you're trying to do that route, which has been such a challenge now for particularly for TV journalists, if they're wanting to cover North Yemen, is that because they can only get into Aden, they're not allowed on the humanitarian flights that are still allowed to fly into Sanaa. You have to take that road up, which means going through hundreds of checkpoints. And getting permission from all the different militias that are involved, or the tribal groups that have set up checkpoints along the way, would be a kind of almost impossibility. And so I've said to them, if you have an all-female crew, as long as you have permission from the Houthis to go into the north and you've had your permission to be in the south, you can do that journey. But as a bunch of big white guys, you can't do that. It's just not possible. So, yeah, it makes a huge difference, and it's much easier for all of us, I think, because we're women.
I think we all agree on this point. Nawal, I want to ask you something. I was watching your videos last night, and again, as I told you before, we went to Marib, to the same place, and we had the same impression that the war is totally stuck. Because the Saudi, the coalition, they control the air. They have this huge, aircraft, bombs, and everything else. But on the ground, it's a different story because they're not fighting, and the Houthis are a militia. So how do you see the future of this confrontation? Because when I went up to the front line and I saw the Manara mountain, I just thought that they're going to be stuck here for the next 2 years without a political agreement. Because you cannot win this war on the ground. What's your impression?
I think we've been saying the same thing for the last 3 years, and Iona's been saying it too, about, it's impossible for either side to have a complete military victory on the ground. And it seems that both sides are waiting to have the complete military victory before they're willing to kind of back down and find a diplomatic solution to what's going on. On the ground, as you said, I went to that point on the front line, what was it now, 1.5 years ago, and you went last month?
1 month ago.
1 month ago, and they're still at the same spot. It's a mountain between Sanaa and Marib, where the government has been pushing, trying to get into Sanaa, and they haven't made much progress. I think they skip from one mountain and then come back. So forward and back, but they haven't really made that much of a big push towards Sanaa, and this is what's been going on for the last 3 years. But at the same time, the humanitarian situation is deteriorating drastically, whilst the warring factions are fighting over ground. And I think it will have to reach a point where they realize that the only way out of this conflict is to reach some sort of diplomatic solution. I covered all 3 rounds of peace talks, the ones in Geneva and Kuwait, and I just think both sides did not have an appetite to find any sort of military solution. The Houthis over time have gained more power, they've gained more control of the areas that they're in control of, especially after President Ali Abdullah Saleh, former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, was killed. And so they see no reason why they should sit around a table to reach a diplomatic solution. And the Saudis want a military victory. I think now they're coming to realize that they're not going to get it, but they definitely want to save face. And so they won't agree to any sort of solution that kind of shows that the last 3 years have been a complete failure. I know now that there's a huge, there's lots of pressure by the international community, by the UK and by the US for a new round of peace talks. There's a new UN envoy, there's a new British ambassador, and maybe we will see some sort of peace talks coming up soon. But personally, I don't see the Houthis particularly agreeing to any sort of solution. I think they feel like they're in control. They feel like now is their time, and they're not willing to give up any power. The UN resolution that was 2216 that came about when the war first started is completely unrealistic. It's asking them to hand over all power and weapons and basically to go back to where they started, which is never going to happen. And I know that the Saudis are resistant to any sort of new resolution. But unless that happens, I don't think we're going to see peace anytime soon. And all we're going to see is a further deterioration of the situation on the ground.
Yeah, I think we all agree on this. What I wanted to ask you is, let's talk about the humanitarian situation. Maybe there is something that not everybody knows, that this is the poorest country of the Arab world, and it was already, it's been the poorest country of the Arab world for a long, long time. 80% of the food that Yemeni people use used to come from the outside, and especially from one place, a very important port, which is called Hodeida. So Hodeida is more or less stuck. Maybe Laura Silvia can explain this to us, but the situation in Hodeida, and why is the humanitarian situation so bad? I mean, because it's really unbelievable.
Yeah, I visited, I think, a huge amount of medical facilities from the south to the north, up to the north of Yemen, including Hodeida, Hamer, and the places close to Sada, but even the south, and also Taiz in a very, very difficult situation. Well, one of the problem is, of course, the access, the physical access, the concrete access into the country for any kind of good. The goods are, stuck in somewhere, and even when arrive the humanitarian aid, if it's not for the Saudis that they drop humanitarian aid, but not so much, they are stuck in somewhere else, because also the militia, they want to control what is inside, what those trucks they carry on. So basically we have a lot of stops of all this humanitarian aid, and the pressure on the aid is really, really less, even though we have really a necessity of helping people. What really media are most focused on, of course, is cholera or other diseases like diphtheria, for example, is present and no one talks about it. Because of course they're spreading very much immediately, and they're scary. But what happened in the war? What happened to the patient they have, for example, kidney problems? What happened to the patient that have cancers? What happened to the patient that have any kind of what we call normal disease for us, and they die because they don't have insulin for example, for diabetes, because they can't clean their kidneys. So that's really terrible. That's really terrible. And also all the side even of the humanitarian crisis is forgotten, is neglected, because it's not cholera, because it's not an emergency. We have a daily emergency, which is, for us, is just the normal way to treat patients in the hospital. So that's one side. The other side is, it really could be very interesting to track what happened to the humanitarian aid when they arrive into Yemen, for example, only in Aden actually, or sometimes, in Sanaa, what happened to them? How many months they stay? They are, in the storage. How many days we count until something arrives from Aden into the north? And time here, it's really something important. And I think it's very difficult to follow, even for local journalists. And I think Nawal can add something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I was
Because
just
you
sorry.
cover humanitarian crisis very well, so.
No, I mean, what you said about we focus a lot on, the big story, basically cholera, diphtheria, and wherever I go in Yemen, like you said, I get dragged into the kidney dialysis wards, and they tell me how they're struggling, and it made me everyone always asks me, how do your family and your husband let you go to Yemen? I mean, they're crazy. Why would they let you go? And actually, one of the main reasons my husband let me go to Yemen the first time after the war began, which 6 months into it, I think, was because when I go to Yemen, I carry 2 huge suitcases. One of them is filled with ice and insulin, and the other one is filled with pills. And it's basically all the medication that his family needs to keep them going, because his father's not well and his brother has diabetes. And you just can't get insulin that still works in Yemen anymore because there's no electricity, and insulin needs fridges. And the pharmacies, you can't trust if they've had their fridges on or not. So you'll buy insulin for extortionate amounts of money. Very expensive to get insulin now. The average Yemeni civilian can't afford insulin. And it doesn't even work because the fridges haven't been on because they don't have petrol or diesel to keep them on. So every 6 months I'll go and I'll have 2 huge suitcases with insulin and pills. And we're really lucky because we can afford to do that. But wherever you go in Yemen, simple diseases, and people just don't have treatments for them. And they don't make the headlines because it's just not, it's not a big enough story. So yeah.
And also they should pay at hospital. We should say that people that go to hospital, they should pay even if you give the birth. Yeah. A lot of women they lose their children, their child, because they don't have they don't have the time to arrive to the hospital, or if they even lose their child because giving the birth was very difficult, they should pay for the surgery. And I met one woman in Odeida, and her husband was killed during the bombing of the neighborhood where the Indians are. And she said, I have $500 to pay because I lose my baby. I had a surgery, and now I don't know what to do. So this is the daily life of Yemenis, actually. It sounds really something really, really sad.
But just to pick up on that, really, the other thing, though, you see in Yemen, we talk about a blockade or a de facto blockade. The reality is there isn't anything now, goods-wise, white goods, cars, anything else, that you cannot buy in Yemen that you could get before the war. So despite the import restrictions on Hodeidah, this has kicked off a massive war economy that individuals on both the sides of the Houthis, the coalition within the Hadi government, businessmen amongst the political elite in Yemen who have been there for decades, are making millions of dollars out of. So when you drive around Yemen, and I've been to the east and to the north and to the west, you will see lorries nose to tail coming across the Saudi border, ironically, with food even, but goods, anything you can get your hands on basically, and equally coming over the Omani border. But the issue is, and even coming up from Aden, the port in Aden is only operating at 40% capacity. That is mainly because the war profiteers who are managing the port and deal with what's going in and out don't want it to expand. And even if it did, the infrastructure of the roads is so bad that the lorries now, there are about 4 hours when you can't get up the road every day between Aden and Sanaa because there's so many lorries, they can't make it up the road, they're overladen with goods going up to Sanaa. But the issue is those goods are being taxed on arrival, whether it be in Aden or coming across the border from Oman. When they go up to Sanaa into Houthi territory, the Houthis tax them as well. When Saleh was still alive, he taxed them as well. So everything was getting triple taxed. And a lot of it was then going onto the black market. The fuel is another thing. The last time I was in Aden, it was easier to get fuel. It all comes into Aden in Sanaa than it was in Aden, because the particular businessman who was involved in importing it into the country, who is aligned to Hadi, didn't feel he was getting enough money for the fuel, so he would stick the tanker in the port and refuse to offload it until everybody in Aden is living in 45 degrees of heat without air conditioning and the fuel's run out, until he gets more money. And this is the issue really with Hodeidah. Yes, the humanitarian impact is huge, and of course, they're not going to be able to make huge amounts of money, these guys, out of bringing in insulin, because like you say, it's costly to bring in, and then they're selling it at extortionate prices that people can't afford to buy. But the issue is with Hodeidah, not only the humanitarian impact that it's having, but also it is kind of fueling, if you like, this war economy. And if there was some way of having a control over it, and I kind of understand that the Saudi-led coalition don't necessarily want the Houthis to have the control of Hodeidah if the port is allowed to freely operate. But if it did freely operate as before, it would kind of pull the rug out somewhat, at least, under this war economy, because there is no way any of those parties who are making all of this money, whether it be the Houthis or the Yemeni government, have any interest in peace talks or bringing an end to this conflict when the current status quo is making them extremely rich. And this is I think one of the biggest barriers actually to ending the war right now is the money that is being made out of it by a group of kind of individuals at the top on both sides who couldn't give a damn about the consequences for the people on the ground. And you can go into the market in Hodeidah, you can go into a market in Lahij, and there will be plenty of food there. But people can't afford to buy it. The government wages haven't been paid for years. The price of food has soared so much, people just simply cannot afford to buy what is sitting in the markets and what is there. And that goes back to the issue over aid ending up in the markets as well to be sold. It's being appropriated. And, you know, as often happens in conflict time, is that aid isn't necessarily reaching the people for free. It's ending up in the markets and being sold on the black markets as well.
So I'm going to open the floor to questions, but just before doing it, and I just already see one person there, I just want to say that there is a big elephant in this room, and it's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, because the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is really the country that is controlling Yemen and the war in Yemen. And there is a lot at stake in Yemen for Saudi Arabia because they have a ruling, de facto ruling. No? Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is in control of this war. This is his war. He's the one who started. He's the Minister of Defense, so he doesn't want to lose this war. And I had the chance to talk to Prince Mohammed a few months ago and asked him about Yemen, and he told me there is no way, absolutely no way, we are going to let an Iranian militia control our border. So Saudi Arabia will not step back from this war, even if there is so much pressure. It just went to London, to New York, even in Los Angeles there were protests against the war in Yemen. But Mohammed bin Salman is not going to step back. Maybe there will be a political solution, but as you said, not only the Houthis, also Saudi Arabia is not ready to do.
But I think over the course of the last 3 years, there have been two biggest losers in this war and three major winners. I don't know if it's three major winners, but, you know, the Yemeni government, they've made so much money out of this war, like you said, with the war economy, making money out of the Saudis. You know, they're not willing to end this anytime soon, because when it does, they have no country to go back to. They'll never be able to go back into Yemen. And, you know, they'll come out of the payroll of the Saudis. And then the second biggest winners are the Houthis, who have, you know, have more control than ever of the parts that, you know, of the northern part of the country, have gained so much power, have more support than they used to. But the two biggest losers really are the Yemeni people and the Saudis. The Saudis have spent so much money on this war and have made no progress yet. So even though he says he's not willing to negotiate, though, you know, I think behind the scenes, they're doing all they can to find some kind of solution to this conflict where they get to save face as well, because it's a big loss for them, and they know that there will not be any military victory at the end of this.
But there is one danger in all of this, and this is really the US, and particularly the increasing hawkish attitude towards Iran. And, you know, you've seen the capabilities of the Houthis increasing with the ballistic missiles, the long-range ballistic missiles, the kamikaze drones, the underwater drones, all these things that they didn't have before the conflict, and that Saudis are still bashing away with the same tools that they had at the beginning of the conflict, but is really kind of, a lot of it swings on what happens out of the White House now. And this is over the Iran deal, this is Iran in the rest of the region and everything else. And it was something we saw at the tail end of the Obama administration, is that the Saudis were sitting and waiting for the Trump administration to turn up to see what they would do. They asked the Americans for help for an attack on Hodeidah at the end of the Obama administration, and they were given a flat no because it was military suicide. But now we see the language coming out of the White House of calling the Houthis an Iranian proxy, that they are an Iranian militia. And if that translates in taking direct action or supporting the Saudi coalition in a more direct way of what the Americans are already doing, I think it's incredibly dangerous. And that is what is one of the really depressing aspects, because the retaliation, of course, will come from Iran, likely in ballistic missile attacks that do actually cause serious damage and casualties within Saudi Arabia. And that, of course, would just mean this war in Yemen would be sucked into a whole new sphere, and the consequences would be unending, really.
And I just want to add that we should not forget the rule of Emirates in this war. Emirates are controlling all borders and are controlling all the coasts, and they are fueling Salafi militias in Taiz against Islahi, who are a Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen, and are creating kind of, they're fueling some war, bad guys of the war. From their perspective, they need to have in Yemen some military control, and we know that their presence in Socotra actually right now it's really important. And Yemenis are very upset about it, because Socotra for Yemenis is something. So we shouldn't forget the rule of Emirates, which is a partner of Saudi Arabia, but at the same time reach some goals in their interest. And Saudis, they didn't yet reach their main interest at the border.
So I see there is a question. Yeah.
The mic isn't on. Okay.
It should be on now.
We can hear you.
Come here.
Just come here.
Come here.
Yeah, I think they want to do it.
All right, I think we're good now. Yemen has been routinely ranked as the worst country in the world to be a woman for many, many years now. I'm curious about how the war has changed women's role in society there, and has it brought anything, any further empowerment, or has their role sort of mainly stayed the same?
I think that Nawal and Laura, Silvia can answer.
Well, we have a huge, the number of the early marriages are increasing due to the fact that some people, they need money. For example, I met a guy in close to Odeida, and they told me I should marry my daughter, which is like 14 years old, because my wife has kidney problems and I need to pay for her. But you give your daughter for $1,000, not $1,200. So we have this evidence in general. From the other side, it's really interesting how war, but this not happened only in Yemen, happened to us in Europe during the Second World War, during the First World War. When men are at the front lines, women, they take their responsibilities. It means that now we have, for example, in Sanaa, we have a woman who is graduated she's an engineer, and she was repairing the cars. And there's no blame on her, basically, on the job that she's doing. We have women who are very brave, and they, for example, they distribute solar systems to the families. They are struggling because they're trying to defend civilians. We even have a woman who was able to stop a very difficult tribal fight in the north. Which made, I think, more than 30 people dead and a lot of people injured. And it was a woman able to do that, to connect tribal leaders and talk in place of men. So it's an environment it's a very challenging environment. We have something very bad, something good. That I just want to say that in the last year, I think we saw from different kind of militias in Taiz, in Aden, in Sanaa, much more attention to women. And even the checkpoints, we have one colleague who is a photographer who was stopped and questioned, accused her of being a spy. It's something that never happened before because we used to travel, as you know now, very easily. And that's happened the last 6 months and 1 year of the war. That's also because women, they are taking some kind of little powers, local powers in some activities, and maybe militias, they feel that we can do something inside the country. But in general, the issue, for example, of the early marriage, it's still an issue and it's bigger than before the war.
Nawal.
No, I couldn't have said it better myself, really. But yeah, I think during the conflict, what we've seen is that women have taken on a lot more responsibility than before. You'll see women, working, taking on the responsibility that the male figures used to take, prior to the conflict, because the men are on the front line. Also, child marriage. I mean, one of the things that have come out of the deteriorating humanitarian situation is that people can no longer afford to feed their children. And so one of the easiest options is, if you can't, feed the mouths you have to feed at home, is to marry off your daughters. And so I've seen middle-class families. It was very common, poorer families, to marry off their daughters so young in Yemen, but now I've seen it within middle-class families of people marrying off their daughters from as young as 9 to 10 years old, not just for the dowry, but also because they just can't afford to keep them in the house and to feed them. In terms of schools, it's if you have sons and daughters, you can't afford to send your daughters to school anymore. You can just about send the sons to school if they're not at the front line. And so now you'll see way less girls in the schools being educated. But one of the interesting things that I saw in the trip before my last one is how women are being used in the conflict. I mean, I saw that the Houthis have recruited a huge army of women called the Zainabiyat, for example, who they are using to go into homes within Sanaa to find out how many sons people have in a family. And they go in, and I was actually at a gatchu, which is what people do in Yemen. But it was a women's gathering, and these women came in and they were wearing green dresses, which is the Houthi color. And they sat down, and I was suddenly told, be quiet, don't say what you really think, just, listen to what these women have to say. So I did. And these women came in to talk about, it was basically Houthi propaganda, and they were asking all the other women how many sons do they have and where do they live. And I heard that what they do is they go into people's homes, and then they tell the Houthis, these people have 5 sons, you need to go for them. And the Houthis go and recruit people to join them in that way. I'm not sure if that's happening with the other militias in Taz and stuff, but that's what I saw with the Houthis. And it was really shocking because that was very new to me, to see something like that in Yemen.
The other thing I've come across, which is kind of related, but having spent quite a bit of time in the rural areas on both sides of the front lines, kind of right up in the mountains, is those men that aren't fighting, that had lost their jobs or are still waiting to get paid from the state, they've all gone back to the villages. So a lot of the people that lived in places like Sanaa and Taiz didn't come from Sanaa and Taiz, they came from villages, and the majority of the Yemeni population is still rural, have gone back to their villages. And of course, the war has been going on for 3 years now, and there's like a baby boom. And I've spoken to tribal sheikhs who are now saying, listen, we're trying to introduce some form of family planning because we're getting more children. We have less food, we have less ability to feed them all. And the longer this war goes on, it's a problem. And family planning is not something that would generally pop into the head of most Yemeni families, and particularly at a sheikh level, at a tribal level, of something that would normally occur to them as an issue and something to start looking at. But yeah, that has become a problem with this kind of baby boom, because the men that aren't fighting and don't have jobs have all gone back to their villages when normally they'd be away for months, if not years at a time. And that's kind of causing an increase in populations in rural areas particularly.
Well, we have to close. I want to thank you once again, all our guests, especially Laura Silvia, for thinking about this.
Thank you, Joanne.
And organizing, and Nawal and Iona for coming. Again, this has been outstanding journalism out of Yemen, so thank you very much.
So much.
And thanks to the festival for allowing us to be here.